Welcome everyone to chapter 2 on the chemical principles. Here's your learning objectives like you're going to see in every chapter. Again, feel free to use these as your own study guide. So why are we going to talk about chemistry? Well, chemistry is vital for understanding biology. If we don't understand chemistry, we can't get to biology. But chemistry has aspects in all biology, which is what healthcare is all about, is life, right? Keeping humans healthy. Also microbes, living organisms. So we're going to have lots of chemical reactions going on inside of microbes as well. Understanding how microbes cause disease. Some of these mechanisms have chemical components to them. Understanding how different diseases are diagnosed and some of these processes. The immune system, so understanding how the immune system fights microbes is based on chemistry, as well as drugs and vaccines and how they work. So it is really important that we understand these basic chemical components before moving on to talk about microbiology. Hopefully quite a bit of this is review for you. I imagine you've probably talked about some of this in your Gen Bio class. I know that I cover quite a bit of it in my anatomy and physiology class. So I don't know whoever you've taken that with, but it's still good to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So it's going to be a nice quick refresher, hopefully for most of us. I am going to break this video up into two parts. So here in part one, we're going to start by talking about atoms and some of the chemical bonds that they form. So starting with the atom, we have, first of all, what is chemistry? So chemistry is the study of the interactions between atoms and molecules. An atom is the smallest unit of matter, and it cannot be subdivided into smaller substances. Atoms then form bonds with each other to make molecules. The atom itself has three parts. Inside of the nucleus, so inside here, we have positively charged protons and neutral neutrons. So those are inside the nucleus, and then surrounding that, spinning around the nucleus, are electrons, and these are negatively charged. You see that we have different layers here. We're going to call those valence shells, or electron. We're going to call them electron shells. The outermost one is called the valence shell. Now, if you can envision, I don't have a picture of it, but envision in your mind the periodic table. As we move across the periodic table, each of those elements has a different number of electrons. The number of electrons is going to be the same to the number of protons, so that those two charges are going to cancel each other out. But as we move across the periodic table, we're increasing in the number of electrons that each element is going to have. And those electrons are going to fill up these electron shells, starting with the innermost shell and moving out. And it's the life goal, if you will, of an atom to fill its valence electron shell. It's most stable when its valence shell is full. The innermost valence shell, as shown here by hydrogen, can only have 2 electrons in it. So this inner one will be filled when it has 2. That's helium. But from then on out, a full valence electron shell has 8 electrons in it. All right, and so like I said, so these atoms are trying to form bonds with other atoms to make their shells full, their valence electron shells full. There's 3 ways that they can do that. There's 3 ways they can form chemical bonds. It can be through covalent bonds, ionic bonds, and we're also going to talk about hydrogen bonds. So a chemical bond occurs when the valence electrons are of the combining atoms are attracted to each other. We're going to talk about those attractions here. We're going to go through each of these types of chemical bonds. The first is a covalent bond. And in a covalent bond, what's key here is that the atoms are shared. So if we look here, we have 4 different hydrogens. Hydrogen, if you remember, wants to have 2 in its 2 electrons in its valence shell. Here's carbon. Carbon has 4 electrons in its valence electron shell. It wants to have 8. It wants 4 more. So these 4 plus the 4 here makes 8. And so they're all going to share so that they're all happy and have full valence electron shells. Carbon now has 8. And if you see, each hydrogen has 2. So everybody's happy and they're sharing their electrons. That's a covalent bond. And there's 2 ways that things can be shared. Those electrons can be shared equally, which is in a non-polar covalent bond. That's the example that we're showing here. Or electrons can be shared unequally. So one of these atoms is going to kind of hog those electrons for itself a little bit. And so that's going to cause an unequal sharing of those electrons, and we call those polar covalent bonds. Here's a couple pictures of that. So in carbon dioxide, this is a covalent bond because they're going to be sharing the electrons. Everybody shares equally. So carbon and oxygen, they share equally. So it's a non-polar covalent bond. However, in water, which has 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogens, the oxygen hogs those electrons. It's better at keeping the electrons for itself. So the oxygen will start to develop a slightly negative charge because it's going to have those electrons by it more than the hydrogens will. And remember, electrons are negatively charged. So if the oxygen has the electrons more, it's going to keep that electron charge for itself. And then the hydrogens will have a slightly positive charge. If they don't have that negative charge as much, then they're going to have a slightly positive charge. And that's what we call a polar covalent bond because it has 2 poles, a negative pole and a positive pole. Those are covalent bonds. And now ionic bonds. So in an ionic bond, what's important to note here is that the atoms are either going to gain or lose an electron. So our example here is salt with sodium and chlorine. So a sodium atom in its valence electron shell has just 1 electron, where chlorine in its valence electron shell has 7. So it just wants to get 1 more. Now if sodium just gets rid of its 1 electron in its valence shell, then down beneath it's going to have 8. So that's what happens. So sodium just gives up its electron and gives it to chlorine. So now sodium has 8 and chlorine has 8 in their valence electron shells. They're both happy. Now, as a result of giving up an electron, that causes sodium to have a positive charge. You lose a negative charge, now you have a total positive charge. Now for chlorine, who gained an electron, then that is going to gain a negative charge. These 2 charges, positive and a negative, are attracted to each other. And so that's what actually is forming. Remember that an ion is a charged atom. So these are 2 ions. An ionic bond is the attraction between these 2 ions. And if we have a lot of them, then they end up having this like lattice or crystal formation. So we have like a positive sodium, a negative chlorine, another positive and another negative, and so on and so forth. So we talked about covalent bonds, where they're sharing, ionic bonds, where they're giving and taking electrons. So here is a comparison of those 3. Over here on ionic bond is a total separation of charges. We have a positive and a negative charge. Here, polar covalent bonds, we just start to see a slight negative in the atom that can hog the electrons a little bit better, and a slight positive in those that can't. And a non-polar covalent bond where they're sharing equally. I forgot to point out there are videos up in the slides earlier. I'm not going to show them here because it seems kind of weird to watch a video in a video. But yeah, I'm going to post this PowerPoint for you. I do recommend that you watch those videos. It's super cute too. If you watch it, you will never ever forget the different types of bonds. It's super cute. All right, and now we're also going to talk about hydrogen bonds. Now, I wish they would change the name of hydrogen bonds because a hydrogen bond is not really a true bond. It's more of an attraction. It's not really a chemical reaction either. Um, so keep in mind when you think of hydrogen bond, think more hydrogen attraction. There's an attraction between these different charges here. So it's an attraction between polar covalent bonds typically, although it's also going to be an attraction between these slight charges in the polar covalent bond and in ions. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. But here, these are all polar covalent bonds. Oxygen has a slight negative charge. That slight negative charge is going to be attracted to the slight positive charge of the hydrogen in another molecule. So this is not going to form a new molecule. Again, this is just an attraction here. We're not actually forming a new molecule. So keep that in mind, but they're just going to be attracted to each other. So they're going to orient themselves next to each other. This is really important, particularly, electronegative atom. Okay. This is important, particularly when we start to look at solutions. So if we put a salt in water, it's going to dissolve. No surprise there, right? You all know that. But how that happens is it's going to be because of these hydrogen bonds. So we have the slight negative charge, remember on the oxygen in the water molecules, is going to be attracted to the positive charge of the sodium. And so those oxygens are going to surround the sodium and pull it off of the crystal structure. And the exact opposite is going to happen with the chlorine. So now our slight positive charges that we see on the hydrogens, remember up here, slight positive on the hydrogen, that's going to be attracted to the negative charge on the chlorine. So they're going to surround the chlorine and pull that off of the crystal. And eventually it's going to all dissolve. So we're talking about solutions here. This is where we have a solute. In this case, we're talking about salt inside of a solvent, which is water in this case. While we're talking about solutions, I'm just going to throw in here molarity. So molarity is just the measure of the concentration of a solution. So if you increase the amount of solute in a solvent, that's going to lead to a higher molarity. We have the Kool-Aid man here. It's like when you dissolve Kool-Aid into Kool-Aid, which was your solute, you're going to dissolve, put more Kool-Aid into water, which is your solvent. That's going to make it be more concentrated, which we would call that having a higher molarity or a higher molar concentration. Either one's fine. This is important because in the cell, it's about 75% water. So just keep in mind as we move forward, as you're talking about any biology, just think that it's happening in water. Pretty much every reaction, every chemical reaction that occurs is happening in water. Anything that's going on in the body is usually bathed in a water solution. It's in an aqueous environment, that's what we call it. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about chemical reactions. So a few different types. We can have a synthesis reaction. So that's where we're going to take different reactants, combine them to make a more complex product. Or the opposite, which is a decomposition reaction, where we're going to take a more complex molecule and break it down to form simpler products. Or an exchange reaction, where it's just going to exchange some of those reactants to make new products. So in order to do any of these chemical reactions, it's going to be making or breaking the bonds between these atoms. So those are kind of our generic types of chemical reactions. As we start to look more at organic molecules, which is what we're typically going to be talking about when we're looking at biology, We have these specific names for these reactions in organic molecules. So for example, a dehydration synthesis. This is a synthesis reaction. So we're going to be putting together to form a more complex product. And we call it a dehydration synthesis because we're removing in water. We're dehydrating it. Think of it that way. You're removing water, you dehydrate it, right? And we're synthesizing it. So that's where that name comes from. And what actually happens is on these monomers of organic compounds, we typically are going to see these OH molecules here. And so we're going to remove one OH from one monomer and an H from the other. H plus OH makes H2O, that's water. Remove that, and then we're going to link those two monomers by two covalent bonds to the oxygen in the middle. That's dehydration synthesis. Hydrolysis is an example of a decomposition reaction when we're talking about organic molecules. So here's what we made on the last slide, right? We're going to do the exact opposite. This word hydrolysis is water. Lysis means like to cut. So here we're going to add water in to cut these two monomers apart. That's where that name comes from. I hope you remember it. So yeah, we're going to add the water in, do the exact opposite of what we just did. So we're going to add the OH to one side and the H to the oxygen to the other monomer. That's hydrolysis. Here's a specific example. So if we take glucose and you notice the OH here and fructose and OH here, we remove the OH and the H releases water, put that together with the oxygen in the middle and two covalent bonds to make sucrose. And then you can do the exact opposite. So you can break it apart through hydrolysis, bring that water in, and that's going to add the hydrogen and the OH on the other side. So this is the formation and breakdown of sucrose, which is table sugar. The rate of chemical reactions can be affected by several things. It can be affected by temperature. So before we go through all of these different effects of chemical reactions, I want you to keep in mind, overall, chemical reactions are going to increase as these molecules bump into each other more often. So what we're thinking about here is if it's going to cause those molecules to bump into each other more often, then that's going to increase the rate of chemical reaction. So that should help you remember that. So increase in temperature is going to increase rate. That's because when we increase temperature, molecules move faster. If they're moving faster and spinning around more, they're more likely to bump into each other and cause a chemical reaction to occur. Also, increase in concentration of the reactant is going to increase the rate. That makes sense. If we have more reactants, then they're more likely to run into each other and cause a chemical reaction to occur. Now, a decrease in particle size is going to increase rate. Reason for that is as you decrease particle size, molecules can move much faster. So if they're smaller, they move faster. If they're moving faster, they're able to run into each other more often and cause a chemical reaction. So it might help you remember those three. And then lastly, catalysts can help to increase the rate of chemical reaction. Catalysts is something that will cause a chemical change to occur without itself being affected. Now, an enzyme is a catalyst that we typically see in biology. So it's a protein that acts as a catalyst. We're going to talk more about catalysts and enzymes later. We are going to go ahead and take a break here, though. So go ahead and take a little brain break, and I'll pick up with part 2 here in a little bit. See you then.